The cake had 3 tiers. My name was spelled wrong on all of them. Not a typo, not a rushed mistake by a distracted baker. My own children had submitted the order form, and they had written Denny's, a name I had never gone by, a name that belonged to no version of me that had ever existed. I had been Daniel for 67 years. Daniel on my birth certificate, Daniel on my marriage license, Daniel on the deed to the house I built with my hands and my savings and 31 years of showing up before sunrise. Daniel. But standing at the edge of my own retirement party, watching my son Marcus raise a champagne flute toward a cake that bore a stranger's name, I understood something that no father ever wants to understand. My children had simply stopped paying attention to me. Not recently. Not since the divorce, or since I sold the business, or since I moved into the smaller house on Carver Street. They had stopped paying attention to me so long ago that they no longer even remembered what I was called. That was the moment I decided to disappear. Let me go back to the beginning, because a story like this one needs its roots examined before you can understand what grew from them. I built Hargrove Electrical from nothing. Literally nothing. A second-hand van, $200 in tools I bought at an estate sale, and a contractor's license I passed on my 3rd attempt after studying at the kitchen table while my wife Alina slept and my children, Marcus and Diane, grew in their beds down the hall. I was 26 years old and terrified in the specific way that only young fathers with no safety net understand. The terror that wakes you at 3 a.m. not with nightmares, but with arithmetic. Over the next 4 decades, I turned that van and those tools into a company with 42 employees, contracts with 3 school districts, and a reputation in this county that meant something. I sent Marcus to university. I sent Diane to university. I paid for Marcus's wedding when he married Tessa, a woman who wore a look of mild disappointment the way other people wore jewelry, always and as though it had simply become part of her face. I paid for the down payment on their first home. I helped Diane launch her interior design business, signing as guarantor on a commercial lease when no bank would touch her, because she was 24 and her only collateral was enthusiasm. I did all of this not to be thanked. I want to be clear about that. A man who helps his children because he expects a return is not a father, he is an investor. I helped them because they were mine, and because Alina and I had agreed, in the wordless way that long marriages communicate their deepest values, that our children would have more runway than we'd had. We wanted them launched. We wanted them airborne. What I did not expect was to become invisible in the process. Alina passed 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the morning I held her hand in the hospice room and watched her face go still. After that, something shifted in my family. Without Alina as the gravitational center, the orbit loosened. Marcus and Diane still called, still came to Christmas, still performed the rituals of family, but I noticed, slowly and then all at once, that the calls grew shorter. That at Christmas they talked to each other across me. That when I shared something, a trip I'd taken, an old friend I'd run into, a book I'd been reading, the response was the same gentle half-attention you might give a television playing in another room. I sold Hargrove Electrical 2 years ago. The buyer was a regional conglomerate, and the number they paid me was significant. I did not tell Marcus and Diane exactly how significant. I told them it was enough to be comfortable, and they accepted this without follow-up questions, which told me everything about how closely they were paying attention to my life. The retirement party was their idea. To be fair to them, it was a generous gesture on its face. They booked a private room at the Meridian Club, invited 40 of my friends and former colleagues, arranged catering and a bar and those small shrimp appetizers on little ceramic spoons that I've never understood but that people seem to feel elevate an occasion. They worked hard on it. I know that. I am not a man who ignores effort. But effort without attention is just motion. And all evening, I watched my children move through that room performing the role of devoted offspring while being, in every way that counted, absent from me entirely. Marcus gave a toast. He talked about everything Dad sacrificed and the values he instilled, and I watched the faces of my former employees, people who actually knew me, who had worked beside me, who remembered specific things I'd said and done, and I could see them waiting for the real stories. The funny ones, the hard ones, the true ones. Instead, Marcus delivered a greeting card in spoken form, and when he sat down, Tessa patted his hand as though he'd successfully completed a task. Diane did not give a toast. She was on her phone for much of the evening, managing what she described to the table as a client emergency, though I noticed the way she angled the screen when she laughed at something, and it did not look like a client emergency. It looked like a group chat. And then the cake came out, and I saw my name spelled wrong on 3 tiers, and Marcus said to Denny's. And 40 people echoed it back, and nobody, not one person in that room, caught it except me. I smiled, I lifted my glass, I drank my champagne. Then I excused myself to use the restroom, walked past the restroom, walked down the service hallway, and left through the side door into the cool September night. The drive to Carver Street took 11 minutes. I sat in my kitchen and made tea and thought for a long time. I was not angry. I want to be precise about this because anger would have been simpler and would have led to different decisions. What I felt was something quieter and more clarifying. It was the feeling of a fog lifting, of seeing at last a situation as it actually was rather than as you had hoped or assumed it to be. My children loved me the way people love a piece of furniture that has always been in the house. They would be distressed if it disappeared. They would feel its absence as a disruption of the familiar, but they had long since stopped seeing it. I was 67 years old, in excellent health, with a considerable sum of money, no professional obligations, and I now understood clearly complete freedom. Because the children who might have needed me, or worried about me, or tried to shape my choices, were not paying close enough attention to do any of those things. That night, I began to make a plan. The first thing I did was call my attorney, Robert Chin, who had been handling my affairs since before Marcus was born. I drove to his office the following Tuesday, and we had a 4-hour conversation that ranged across topics Robert had not expected to cover that week. By the time I left, I had set in motion a series of legal and financial arrangements that would take about 6 weeks to finalize. The second thing I did was call my old friend Paulette, who had retired 3 years earlier and moved to Lisbon. Paulette and I had been friends since our children were small, and she was one of those rare people who become sharper and funnier and more honest as they age, as though life were clarifying them rather than wearing them down. I told her what had happened at the party. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Daniel, you have been treating your life like it belongs to someone else. When are you going to pick it up?" I told her I was picking it up right now. The third thing I did was not call Marcus or Diane. They texted, of course. Marcus sent a message the morning after the party. "Great night. Sorry you slipped out early, must have been tired. Tessa says the shrimp things were amazing." Diane sent a voice memo that was 40 seconds long and covered, in order, an apology for being distracted, an explanation of the client's situation, a brief mention that I seemed quiet at the party, and a question about whether I'd watched a television program she'd recommended 2 months ago. I responded to both with brief, warm messages. I did not mention leaving through the side door. I did not mention the cake. I was not going to have a confrontation. Confrontations are for situations that can still be corrected. What I had understood, walking out through that service hallway, was that nothing needed to be corrected. Everything was, in fact, about to begin. 6 weeks after the retirement party, I put the Carver Street house on the market. It sold in 9 days. I had already arranged everything. A long-term rental in a coastal town in Portugal, not far from where Paulette lived. A structured program of architectural history courses at a university in Porto that accepted older students, because architecture was something I'd always loved and never studied. A list of hiking trails in the Douro Valley that I intended to work through methodically. A small sailboat I'd looked at online and planned to test in the spring. Financial arrangements Robert and I had discussed were, in their way, the most considered thing I'd ever designed. Not punitive. I'm not a punitive man, and my children, whatever their failures of attention, had not done anything to deserve punishment. But I had spent 40 years organizing my financial life with Marcus and Diane as its implicit beneficiaries. The investments, the insurance structures, the estate, all of it had been arranged around the assumption that I was building something to pass down. I spent those 6 weeks quietly rebuilding it around a different assumption, that I was building something to live. The estate didn't disappear. I wasn't irrational about this, but I restructured it substantially. A significant portion went into a charitable foundation, something Alina had always wanted, oriented around music education for children in under-resourced schools, which had been her particular passion. A portion went into a trust with specific conditions and a 10-year horizon. The remainder, the part that would once have been their inheritance in any practical near-term sense, was converted into the architecture of my new life. I was not destroying their future. I was simply removing myself from the center of it. They were both in their late 30s. They were healthy and employed and capable. The runway I'd given them had been long enough. What happened next was theirs to build. I mailed 2 letters on a Tuesday morning in October, one to Marcus and one to Diane. The letters were neither cold nor lengthy. I told them I was well. I told them I was making some changes and moving abroad for a time. I told them I loved them and that I was findable. They had my phone number, and it would continue to work, but that I was going to stop waiting to be found. I told them that if they wanted a relationship with me, I would welcome it, but that I was no longer available to be a piece of furniture in their lives. I did not use those words exactly. I used kinder words, but that was the meaning. Then I locked the Carver Street house for the last time, handed the key to the realtor's lockbox, drove to the airport, and flew to Lisbon. What happened next, I did not anticipate, and perhaps I should have. Marcus called while I was somewhere over the Atlantic. I know this because the voicemail was there when I landed, 11 hours later, and it was 7 minutes long. I had never heard my son speak for 7 uninterrupted minutes about anything that wasn't sports or business, but this voicemail was different. He called back 3 more times while I was in the taxi from the airport. Diane sent 41 text messages. I did not respond that day. I checked into the apartment I'd rented in the Alfama neighborhood, stood on the small terrace overlooking the terracotta rooftops and the wide shimmer of the Tagus, and breathed the saltantile smell of a city that did not know my name. It was the first moment in as long as I could remember that the future felt genuinely open, not like a void, like a door. I called my children the following morning their time. I spoke to Marcus for 45 minutes. It was the longest real conversation we had shared in years, and it had the texture of a real conversation, uncomfortable in places, surprising in others, with silences that meant something. He said, "Dad, I didn't even know you were unhappy." I told him I hadn't been unhappy. I had been invisible, which was different and harder to see from the outside. He said, "The cake. God, Dad, the cake." And he started to cry, which was the first time I'd heard my son cry since Alina's funeral. I told him I wasn't punishing him. I told him I wasn't disappearing. I told him that what I was doing was the opposite of disappearing. I was, for the first time in a long time, appearing to myself. The conversation with Diane was harder and better. Diane has always been the more direct of my 2 children, and she said things that I think she needed to say for a long time, that she had sometimes felt that my love was conditional on being witnessed as a success, that she had performed competence for me because she was afraid of my disappointment. This was painful to hear and important. I told her some things that I think I had needed to say for a long time too, that I had felt unseen by her, that I had translated her distraction as indifference, that I should have said something before it calcified. We did not resolve everything in one phone call, but we started, which is all a start needs to be. I have been in Portugal for 14 months now. I completed the first year of the architectural history program and am enrolled in the second. My professor, a precise and passionate woman named Dr. Ferreira, told me last semester that I had the eye of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding how structures bear weight, which is the best thing anyone has said about my academic work, and which is probably true, given that I spent 40 years in electrical contracting. I hike every Sunday. I have worked through most of the Douro Valley trails and have started driving north to the Minho on weekends. I bought the sailboat in April. It is small, and I am still learning, and I have capsized it twice, which Paulette finds unreasonably funny. Marcus and Tessa visited in June. They stayed for 10 days, which was longer than any of us had spent together in years, and it was not without friction. Tessa remains someone who expresses her disappointments atmospherically rather than directly, and Marcus still sometimes defaults to performance over presence. But there were also mornings on the terrace with coffee and bread and real conversation, and one afternoon on the sailboat where Marcus laughed in a way I hadn't heard since he was 11, and those things were enough. More than enough, they were the whole point. Diane came alone in September, just the 2 of us for a week, and it was the best time I have spent with my daughter in her adult life. We walked until our feet ached. We ate late. She told me about her business, not the curated success version, but the real version with the cash flow problems and the difficult clients and the ideas she wasn't sure about. I told her about the degree, about the boat, about what it felt like to be a student again at 67. On her last night, over dinner at a restaurant where we'd somehow ended up being the last table, she said, "Dad, you look like yourself." I think she meant it as a compliment. I think she was also saying she hadn't seen this version of me before, which made me understand that I hadn't shown it to her, that I had been so focused on providing, on building, on being the foundation of something, that I had never let my children see what lived inside the foundation. There is one more thing to tell. 3 months after I left, I received a letter from Robert Chin. The trust I'd established had a provision he was now implementing. A letter to Marcus and Diane explaining that access to the trust in 10 years was connected not to behavior or achievement but to participation in a family program I'd endowed with a counseling practice in the city, 3 sessions per year for the next decade. Not mandatory, they could decline. But declining would redirect their portion to the Music Education Foundation. Both of them enrolled within a week. I don't know what they talk about in those sessions, and I don't ask. That's not the point. The point is that I'd spent 40 years trying to ensure my children's financial future and had done nothing to invest in our future as people who knew each other. The trust was my attempt to correct that imbalance, to make the same bet on connection that I'd always made on comfort. My name is Daniel. I know how to build things and how to let them go. I know how to walk out of a party through a side door and into something better. I know that the best inheritance I can leave my children is not money. It's proof that a life can be reconstructed at 67, that reinvention is not a young person's privilege, that it is never too late to appear. The cake at the Meridian Club, said Denny's. The man who boarded a plane to Lisbon was Daniel, more completely than he'd been in years. And somewhere over the Atlantic, at 38,000 feet, with the lights of the cabin dimmed and the other passengers sleeping, he smiled and closed his eyes and finally, rested.